Well, thank you for that update. And now we move on to our scheduled programming for February, starting with the story that unfortunately the Council for British Archaeology had to announce that this year they will not be able to undertake their Festival of Archaeology, which also actually encompassed the Day of Archaeology, which was a sort of the focus of the festival, but also it was a 2 week grand affair. Earlier this month, people who had previously been involved with the festival were sent an email, myself included, and also you've been involved in the past as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the director, Mike Hayworth, said the following. Dear colleague, I am writing to update you about plans for the Festival of Archaeology. 2019 will be the Council for British Archaeology's 75th anniversary, and we are excited about starting to make plans for how we might mark that with a series of projects, including a UK-wide festival. Because of those new plans, and due to a drop in our 2018-2019 income for the Festival of Archaeology, our trustees have made the difficult decision that we will not be able to coordinate a festival this year in July 2018. As ever, we rely on your generous support in organising amazing festival events that make the festival such a success. Last year, over 300 organisers put on 1,000 events nationwide, and we want to continue to work with you to make a new festival even bigger and better. We are starting now to put together a new fundraising strategy to secure the future of the festival, and will be launching a short online consultation with organisers to begin to develop ideas for the 2019 festival later this spring. So later in 2018 they'll begin that short online consultation. And I think when this first occurred, I sort of got in touch with you, and you used a curious phrase involving a canary. What do you think this might indicate?
The phrase I used was "canary in the mine shaft." You ought to recognise that. You live in a mining, former mining area.
I was trying to segue. I was trying. No, I know what you mean. And in that sense, this could set a no, not even this could set. This could be an indication of something which actually has been bubbling below the surface in British archaeology for a while.
Absolutely. For people who aren't familiar with the phrase, what it actually means, it's the canary that was sent down the mine shaft with the miners that would pass out first if there were poisonous gases around.
Yeah.
It was a sign of imminent danger,
yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
And I think to get it.
Well, first of all, what is the festival? Why should we care?
I was going to say to give people who aren't familiar with the festival an idea of how important it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the shop window for British archaeology to the wider public. It started off as a day. It's grown to become, I think in the last incarnation, it was a fortnight of events all over the UK, which enable people to access anything from an academic lecturing about BB2 in a museum to
sign me up.
Seriously academic interactions to kids in the park digging test pits and doing archaeology alongside experienced archaeologists, vocational archaeologists and professional archaeologists. It brought together everybody in one big wonderful display of what we do as a profession and as a sector.
Exposure, showcasing. Yep.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth mentioning what the CBA actually is, because I mean Mike Hayworth in his email talked about the 75th anniversary. It was set up just after World War II to be a public facing organisation representing archaeology, and it has this amazingly wide brief from representing archaeological truth to power in Whitehall and Westminster to acting as a bridge and a facilitator within the archaeological sector, linking academic archaeologists and developer-funded archaeologists to the vocational archaeologists in local societies and local heritage projects, and bringing on through the Young Archaeologists Club, the YAC, future generations of archaeologists. So it is in terms of the sector, it is a really important organisation, and it was almost, because given when it was set up at the same time as organisations like the NHS, it's almost like an NHS for archaeology. It was something And they made a point of this with the festival, that it was free at the point of use. It's there for the public as a public good.
Well, in that sense, it's worthwhile just saying that yeah, I mean, he does mention the 75th anniversary, but he also mentions the fact that this festival, you can't shy away from the fact that it really is corralling a whole host of voluntary activities.
Herding cats.
Herding cats. And I was happy to be a cat in the past, certainly.
Absolutely, me too.
But in that sense, what they were doing was they were operating as overseers, providing, as I think, as you've said, off camera, the insurance element, public liability,
which is absolutely crucial these days in terms of public event.
Yeah, providing a web portal through which a list of local events people could easily search for what was happening in their area. And so that, in that sense, the CBA not being part of it is a shame. They do recommend that this year people try and go ahead with some sort of Festival of Archaeology under the tagline Festival of Archaeology Fringe 2018, essentially as like a hashtag where people can still find local events in their area. And I suppose this leaves me wondering whether this is, in fact, as you've hinted with the Canary, kind of unfortunately the shape of things to come. Now the reason I say that is that, I mean, realistically, ever since I graduated, archaeology has been undergoing a very difficult decade. There are so many archaeological projects, and even in the case of this festival, which simply wouldn't go ahead were it not for significant voluntary contributions of time or expertise, and even people donating to these sorts of projects. It sort of feels a little bit as though I've been obviously aware of that ever since I graduated, and people certainly at the bottom of these, as it were, on the ground, have been aware of these issues. I'm not saying the CBA isn't aware, but perhaps this is a ripple back effect in terms of their capacity now to do things which they clearly are very passionate about. But perhaps this is a question of how much society values archaeology.
I think we need to point out to people, in connection with what we just said, actually, quite how much the CBA is asked to punch above its weight for the archaeological sector. Compared to English Heritage and the National Trust, it's a tiny organisation, and yet it has to do everything from organising the festival and bringing on this future generation through organising the YAC, to acting as a sector expert body and lobbyist, to be frank, in Whitehall and Westminster. And it does that on a tiny staff and a tiny budget, which actually was first cut drastically by the government in the coalition government of 2010, when Vince Cable, as one of the cuts under the austerity programme, Vince Cable, current leader of the Liberal Democrats, cut the funding indirectly to CBA through cuts in other government grants.
Well, actually, it's funny. Around about the same time, English Heritage was drastically restructured, so that there was it no longer had the public-facing property management element connected to its function as a planning and monument scheduling interest. So more or less, the English Heritage partly became National Trust Part 2, as it were. But also, obviously, as you've mentioned, there is the National Trust as well in Britain. And I can't help but wonder whether, I mean, given that clearly central government has lost its taste for funding archaeology adequately, and to be blunt, that is the case.
Yes.
I can't help but wonder whether actually this is, unfortunately, the shape of things to come in terms of the CBA, because the National Trust, as you know, I could sit here and rant all day about how they are essentially a membership generating organisation. I don't think that they fulfil the remit that they were originally set up for. And while yes, okay, they do look after, by definition, lots of different monuments and lots of different houses and structures and landscapes, again, a lot of that is based on voluntary work, and it is more or less about self-sustaining as an organisation. Is this? It would be a genuine shame to see the CBA become even more membership focused. And incidentally, you can become a member of the CBA. That is something that is possible.
And I think we should actually post the links as well as part of the story.
Yeah, we should. But is that more or less what archaeologists should be gearing up for? If this is the Canary, then to extend that metaphor into a plumbing metaphor, um, if the canary is indicating what's coming down the pipe, should we be forming ourselves to fit, as opposed to lamenting the fact that this sort of 30-year period is over?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is I think we're in a nationally, politically, and in the archaeological sector, and we reflect the communities we're a part of, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Everything is up for grabs at the moment. All the old certainties seem to have been thrown over,
Mm-hmm.
partly by the austerity program since 2010. And you're right, all the organisations that you've mentioned that receive any kind of government funding, and even the government's own department that deals with this area, the DCMS, they've all taken hits of something like between 30 and 40% of their budget since 2010.
And incidentally, the DCMS, just for those of you outside the UK, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, already has a very broad agenda there, a very broad remit. So
Indeed.
heritage has been a small part of a increasingly small and divided cake, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, local authorities have been, again, taken massive hits to their budgets. Just yesterday, in fact, Northampton County Council put through an emergency budget, which will see 21 of its libraries closed and other libraries that are going to remain open, only opening one day a week. I personally, I'm a member of a board of trustees of a Grade 2 listed building, which runs as a community centre by a charitable trust. And up until now, we've been in receipt of local government funding. We've been told to budget in future with the possibility that there will be no local authority funding. It's a Grade 2 listed building. It needs some refurbishment, but the council, which still owns the building, hasn't got the budget to do it.
No.
So, every which way you turn, heritage is being put under pressure. And I think as practitioners within the sector, but also reaching out to the public, and this is where the CBA comes in again, is really important. We have to be proactively asking these questions, and coming up with strategies to, if we think it's worth saving, we have to come up with a strategy to save it.
Well, and actually, that's something which frequently frustrates me in this whole discussion, is that people, if you ask them if they value heritage and history, they will say absolutely. Whether it's a very strong connection to a local monument or a more sort of generalized sense that history and their identity is important to them, they do value history. It is just this question of essentially who pays for it, because people don't tend to think that history and heritage needs to be paid for. It just seems to just happen, or rather, it has happened, hasn't it? It is interesting that we need to remind people that these sectors, that this sector exists in the present, but also, I suppose more broadly, it raises philosophical questions about what is the purpose of government, what is the purpose of taxation. How are our interests represented on a national scale? And this is also actually, in terms of budgets and funding being cut, being reflected, I suppose, away from the public-facing element of the CBA, right up to the academic end of things. For example, this month we've seen strikes across the country by young academics, not just archaeologists, but across the spectrum of specialisms, on strike in defence of their pensions. It just raises a question as to what are our priorities as a nation going forward, and how can we, as archaeologists, I suppose, best represent the benefits of having a well-funded archaeological sector.
Absolutely, and that dispute among the academics comes against the background of, for example, in the last few weeks, we've had a government minister with the responsibility for higher education questioning whether certain degrees should be as fully supported as others because they have less economic value to the country.
Yeah.
And in terms of that dispute, and again, I think people's perceptions, maybe of the academic in the ivory tower, the cliche, perhaps because we haven't engaged properly. We've always been talking about, we're often talking about communication on Watching Briefs, and we will continue to. We maybe haven't sold as well as we could have done what we actually do, but the idea of the academic in the ivory tower who's got a job for life, it is completely out of date now. A lot of these young academics who have been on strike this week, and there was a wonderful picture actually was tweeted from the Institute of Archaeology outside UCL, where they hung a banner, "Archaeology Careers in Ruins." But
there was one outside the York department yesterday that said, "Keep your early Neanderthal art hands off our pensions," and we'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah, that's a great preview of the story we're going to be covering later. But I mean, what a lot of people won't realise is that, particularly a lot of younger academics, they're not on permanent contracts. They're on effectively casualised contracts where they only get paid for the hours they actually lecture, and of course their pension. Their pensions. Well, anybody knows that the days of a final salary pension are gone. But particularly in this kind of circumstance, there have even been anecdotal reports of managements threatening to withhold wages for lecturers who are working to rule, so that they only fulfil the exact terms of their contracts and don't do any other work.
So in other words, if you're not bending over backwards to, in my opinion, answer questions from students that aren't necessarily, strictly speaking, part of your job as a lecturer. For example, if a student asks you, "Can you essentially write my essay for me?" I don't think you should. If they don't do that, then they find themselves being threatened.
Absolutely, but it's a very difficult situation. I mean, I remember my family is at university at the moment, and they were saying that among the student bodies, there's a lot of support for what the lecturers are doing. In fact, the students have been appearing on the picket line supporting the lecturers. But at the same time, there are concerns among the students about particularly people who are in the run-up to not just final exams, but other exams. The reports of exams being cancelled or postponed, and other things which will
have a knock-on effect.
It's partly to do again with, and this goes back to our discussion about the CBA and about planning. The past has, like academia, has been increasingly commoditized as a product that can be sold.
Well, but also more broadly, and I guess this, what you're hinting at there is that everything seemingly is being commoditized. What is the economic value of this degree versus that degree? So on and so
forth.
It's the priority at the moment, and this is where I was talking about, I suppose, the philosophy of what is the function of government. The priority at the moment is somehow that a national identity is intimately tied up with economic productivity. It's actually strangely Marxist, funnily enough, even though it's being put forward by the Conservatives. And yet, I would say that as, for example, Churchill said in the Second World War, to elaborate, or to sort of paraphrase, what is a country if not something that has culture, something that has history, something that has art, something that has thinkers, people who are essentially paid to think as opposed to produce money. It's a strange time that we find ourselves in, and I think the CBA struggling to put on a festival is actually an indicator of something possibly coming down the pipeline.